So if you had visited Monticello, say 20 years ago, you would have come up the mountain and you would have just seen Jefferson's beautiful neoclassical villa. But what we wanted to do was change that. We wanted to restore the landscape of slavery, because if you had come up this mountaintop in Jefferson's time, the first thing you would have seen most likely would be enslaved people. There would have been no place on this mountaintop that slavery was not visible. And we want to restore that, make that known to visitors who come here today. So we're now in the middle of recreating or restoring dwellings along Mulberry Row, that main plantation street, as well as rooms attached to the house just behind us. So all of this is part of an effort to sort of shift the focus away from just Jefferson and talk about the dozens of other people who essentially made his life possible. Sally Hemings was part of a very large family of enslaved people here at Monticello who numbered about 80 people. And she was the daughter of the Hemings matriarch, Elizabeth Hemings. And we do believe that years after his wife's death, Jefferson fathered 6 children with Sally Hemings, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. Their names were Eston, Madison, Beverly, and Harriet. The Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson controversy has been one that's been going on for over 200 years. But I think one thing that we really want to do now in the current initiatives, that we're embarking here on the mountaintop, is to focus on Sally Hemings herself. We want to divide her from Thomas Jefferson and that controversy and really focus on her as a person. Because I think in this 200-year debate or discussion, she's always been a foil for Jefferson. She's never been seen in her own light. And we want to restore her humanity.
So we're standing inside of the space that we'll be interpreting as Sally Hemings' quarter. We believe it was either this space or the one next to it to the west. Perhaps you can imagine her here with her children. Maybe she's doing some mending of their clothes, or they're cooking, the last meal of the day, or they're sitting around and sharing stories of their day, as well as perhaps their past, a typical family activities that would have gone on in this space. So behind me, what you see is the restoration of Monticello's South Wing. This wing was built in 1802. So the South Wing held a lot of domestic service spaces as well as slave quarters in Jefferson's time. After Jefferson died and Monticello was sold, it was actually rebuilt a couple times by the Levy family in the 19th century. So in the 1940s, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation restored the South Wing to what they thought was its best appearance. Not only did they restore the kitchen, the smokehouse, and the cook's room, but they also put bathrooms into what were slave quarters and a dairy. And so it's much of this material that we've been removing over the past couple months, and we are now at the point where we're restoring the spaces, what we think is a more accurate representation to what they would have looked like in Jefferson's time. And we know that because there's physical evidence as well as documentary evidence that tells us very specifically what Jefferson wanted. So he even draws a plan of the South Wing, a plan to scale. So it's really tremendous evidence that shows exactly how big the rooms were and what the rooms were used for. So we know what space was the dairy, we know where the slave quarters were and the smokehouse. That's all very clear. But what was exciting is that when we removed that 1940s material, we were able to find physical traces of where these walls would have been placed. And so we can put them back very, very accurately. So you can see that the carpenters have started to put back a sill plate, but they've aligned the sill plate with what we call an architectural ghost. So here is where a stud would have sat upon the stone wall in Jefferson's time, and then the space was plastered and whitewashed against it. And when that stud goes away, what's left is this gap in the finishes that tell us exactly where the stud would have been in its size. So we're able to put it back. And you can see this wall was canted, right? Because we have a ghost on this side, on the other side. of the fireplace that shows where the wall would have sat against the fireplace. And so we're able to, even though a typical carpenter would love to have a nice straight wall, we're putting it back just a bit out of square, because that's the way that the evidence is telling us it sat in Jefferson's time. So we are in the South Pavilion cellar, and this is a building, one of the first buildings built on the mountaintop by Jefferson, finished by 1770. And the space originally was a kitchen, and actually we are standing about 4 feet above the original floor level. And why that is because Jefferson raises the floor level in 1809 after he builds the south wing, and he turns this into a wash house when the larger kitchen was built to the east. And the amazing thing in this space, not just that it's this early and then it survives, but also that earlier kitchen survived largely intact underneath this great fill, this wonderfully, I call it great fill because it's got a lot of artifacts mixed into it. So, we think of fill as pretty boring, but in this case, all of that trash that they're bringing in with the dirt they're pulling from somewhere contains lots of cultural materials, and the archaeologists are able to find just really amazing pieces of ceramic and pins and thimbles, toothbrush heads, a lot of great artifacts that will give us a sense of how people lived on the mountaintop. In addition to these great artifacts, what they also found was evidence of this first kitchen, and actually evidence that it changed over time. And so they've come down upon the original fireplace where Jefferson's early meals, he and his wife lived in the room above for several years until the main house was ready for them to move in. So that fireplace was uncovered, as well as a stew stove, which is a very high-style kitchen appliance for the mid and late 18th century that would have let Jefferson cook this high-style French cuisine that he's probably having in Williamsburg at the governor's palace. We suspected that he had a stew stove. We didn't know for sure. He draws it on a document in the 1770s, but we didn't know if it was built. But luckily enough, tremendous evidence survives of this stew stove, this four-burner, you could call it, stew stove, this rubble, sort of ruinous structure down below. So right now, the archaeologists have removed as much of the material as they're going to for this part of the project, and they're cleaning up the site for final photos and documentation. So you can see they're meticulously cleaning between the bricks, and they have measured everything in. It's really an intensive process, but it allows us to gather and record as much information on the site as possible so it can be analyzed in the future. When we finish the restoration of the South Wing, we hope that visitors will be able to come and experience perhaps a bit more of the slave life at Monticello, to understand how Monticello functioned in the plantation context, to see what supported the main house. But we're also very, very excited about being able to put back Sally Hemings' quarter, this tremendously important person on the mountaintop, important in American history.